In the bitter cold winter of 1847, a young woman was brought to a quiet religious hospital outside Salem, Massachusetts. She couldn't remember her name. She spoke in a language no one could identify. And what happened during her 37-day stay was so terrifying, the doctors burned most of the records. But one journal survived, hidden in an attic for over 100 years. Now, for the first time, we're sharing what really happened. This isn't a ghost story. This is a warning. If you're ready to uncover the truth buried by church and science alike, hit subscribe, comment your state, and stay with us, if you dare. Part 1. The Admission. Approximately 1,000 words. It was January 15, 1847. Snow covered the quiet streets of Millbrook, Massachusetts, a small town about 15 miles northwest of Salem. The cold that winter was brutal. Townsfolk said even the Merrimack River seemed to freeze in place, and the sky never stopped weeping gray. At the edge of town stood the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, a brick hospital run by Protestant ministers. It was the biggest medical building between Boston and the New Hampshire border, with 20 beds and 7 doctors. Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore had built it in 1834, believing no one could be truly healed without first saving their soul. So every morning began with prayer, and every night ended with scripture. Whether you were Catholic, Jewish, or had no faith at all, you were expected to follow the hospital's Christian routine. The staff, all Protestant men trained at Harvard. The head physician, Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, was a serious man, only 34 years old but already known for his calm, sharp thinking. He believed mental illness wasn't caused by demons or sin, but by something deeper in the human mind. He kept journals, hundreds of them, recording every strange case, every unusual behavior. But the one that would haunt him forever began on a freezing morning when a horse-drawn carriage pulled up outside the hospital's gates. Inside was a young woman. No coat, no shoes, just a thin, frozen cotton dress. Her skin was olive-toned, her hair long and dark. A local farmer named Silas Hartwell had found her unconscious in his barn, lying in a pile of hay, clutching a small pouch and a strange brass locket with no markings. No one knew where she came from. And when she woke up, she didn't either. She whispered her name was LaToya. Just LaToya, nothing more. Dr. Aldrich noted right away that something wasn't normal. Despite the freezing temperatures, her body was in near-perfect condition. No frostbite, no shivering, her heartbeat was steady, her breath calm, but what unsettled him most was how she spoke, soft, clear, and exact, like she was thinking 5 steps ahead of every question. At first, LaToya said she didn't remember anything, not the barn, not the town, not even how she got to Massachusetts. When asked about her religion, her hands started to shake. Her lips moved rapidly, whispering in a strange language. It wasn't Latin, at least, not quite. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the youngest doctor on staff and a language expert, listened closely. He said it sounded like a mixture of Latin, French, and something else, maybe African or Caribbean dialects. She speaks it like it's her mother tongue, Brennan wrote in his notes. But when I asked her about it, she looked confused and said she only speaks English. That night, things got weirder. Sister Mary Catherine, a nun from the nearby Catholic convent who helped with nursing, reported LaToya would sit up in bed minutes before anyone entered the room. She'd ask for water just before the well outside ran dry. And she always woke up a second before the church bell rang, even though the sound was faint and distant from her room. She knows what's going to happen. Before it does, the nun whispered to Dr. Aldrich the next morning. Even stranger were the stories from other patients. Mrs. Eleanor Hitchcock, an older woman recovering from pneumonia, claimed LaToya spoke to her in her sleep, describing memories from Eleanor's childhood that she had never told anyone. The next night, another patient begged to be moved, saying LaToya stared at the window for hours, whispering things under her breath, eyes wide open. Dr. Aldrich began keeping LaToya under closer observation. She answered his medical questions without hesitation. She was calm, too calm. When other patients cried or shouted in pain, she didn't flinch. When shown a Bible, she stared at it for a full minute before quietly saying, "That's not the book you think it is." She refused to eat meat, refused to sleep with the lamp out. And whenever she passed the hospital chapel, she turned her head and muttered something under her breath, something no one could translate. One morning, the brass locket she'd arrived with disappeared. No one admitted to moving it. That same day, the hospital's basement furnace stopped working for 6 hours, even though it had been freshly fueled. The halls grew colder than they'd ever been, so cold, some of the patients began to show signs of hypothermia. LaToya, she didn't even pull up her blanket. As the days passed, fear spread quietly among the staff. The doctors whispered in corners. The nurses prayed more often. Even Reverend Whitmore stopped visiting her room. Dr. Aldrich wrote in his private journal, "Greater than, there is something ancient about her. Not old, but, before." Before language, before science. I do not yet understand it. But I fear I am beginning to feel it. LaToya would stay at Blessed Mercy for 37 days. What happened next would shake the faith of every man and woman inside those walls. And only one man would dare to record it. To be continued. Right finger comment. Ready for part 2 inches if you want to keep going. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter in LaToya's true, terrifying story. Part 2. The Unknown Tongue. It began with a whisper. Mrs. Eleanor Hitchcock, recovering from pneumonia in the next bed over, told the nurses that LaToya had spoken to her in the middle of the night. But not just spoken, LaToya had described, in perfect detail, the death of Eleanor's husband, a man who had drowned 5 years earlier while fishing alone on a foggy lake. Eleanor had never told anyone how he died. Not even the doctors at Blessed Mercy. When confronted, LaToya looked confused. I never spoke to her, she said softly. I don't even know she had a husband. Dr. Aldrich assumed the old woman had imagined it. But that doubt began to crack 3 nights later. It was January 18th. The halls of Blessed Mercy were silent except for the faint creak of floorboards and the moan of winter wind through the windows. Dr. Aldrich was making his usual evening rounds when he paused at LaToya's door. She was sitting upright in bed, her eyes closed. Then she began to speak. It was the same strange language she had used during intake, but this time her voice was stronger, clearer. The sound rolled through the ward like a wave, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic. Every patient nearby began to stir. Thomas Brewster, a young carpenter with a badly injured leg, later told Drive Aldrich something impossible. As LaToya spoke, he began to see visions. Vivid ones. He saw firelight and palm trees, people dancing in a circle, their hands covered in paint, their mouths moving in silent prayer. He smelled smoke, heard drums, felt tears on his cheeks. And when LaToya stopped speaking and opened her eyes, Thomas was crying. He couldn't say why. Dr. Aldrich, shaken but determined to remain rational, recorded it. In his journal, the patient exhibits no signs of hysteria or melancholia. And yet, her presence seems to influence those around her in ways I cannot explain. I am torn between the discipline of science, and the growing sense that something else, something unnameable, is unfolding in front of me. And something was changing, subtle at first. Nurses noticed their shifts felt easier, less chaos, fewer emergencies, when LaToya was calm. But on the rare occasions when she grew agitated, the entire hospital seemed to suffer. Instruments went missing, lamps flickered, even the walls felt colder. Strangest of all, the hospital's coal furnaces, which had struggled all winter to heat the old brick building, suddenly worked perfectly. The chronic rat problem, gone within days of LaToya's arrival. The staff didn't talk openly about it. But the fear was growing. Then came Reverend Whitmore's visit. The stern old man had built Blessed Mercy himself. He rarely feared anything, until he spent an hour alone with LaToya in the hospital chapel on January 20th. When he emerged, his face was pale. His hands trembled. He clutched his prayer book as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Dr. Aldrich asked what had happened. The Reverend didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. That young woman possesses knowledge no Christian soul should carry. This isn't a medical condition, doctor. We are walking in places where only God's judgment should follow. The Reverend never visited again. Over the following days, Aldrich noticed that patients improved or worsened based on their proximity to LaToya. Those near her bed seemed to recover faster, even if their conditions had seemed hopeless. But others who disliked her presence began to decline for no apparent reason. Meanwhile, Brennan, fascinated by the unknown language LaToya spoke, took his research to the Salem Historical Society. And that's where he found something chilling. A set of maritime records, dating back to 1823. A slave ship named the Esperanza had wrecked off the Massachusetts coast. Among the survivors was a 4-year-old girl named LaToya. The record described her as speaking tongues unknown to Christian ears, and practicing healing techniques no doctor could explain. According to the log, she was placed in the care of a strict Presbyterian family in nearby Peabody. 3 years later, she vanished, leaving behind only a note written in the same unknown language that Dr. Brennan had recently heard her speak. If it was truly the same girl, that would make LaToya 28 years old. But the patient in Blessed Mercy looked no older than 22. Dr. Brennan's hands shook as he wrote in a letter to his old professor at Harvard. The implications are staggering. If this is the same individual, then either she has aged at a slower rate, or she is not human in the way we understand the term. Dr. Aldrich dismissed the idea, at first. But when he mentioned the Esperanza to LaToya during a routine checkup, something in her broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Her body trembled. She gripped the brass locket around her neck so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then she spoke. Fragments, at first, images more than words. A ship, tossed by a violent storm. Chains clinking, men screaming, the stench of blood and salt. And a voice, always a voice, calling to her in a language older than time. She spoke of a house where she was taken, and the people who tried to wash away what I was. And then, of the woods. Where she escaped, where she found others who remembered, the old ways. Then, quietly, with no drama, she said something that made Drive Aldrich's blood go cold. Greater than, I don't age as others do. To be continued in Part 3. Right finger comment. Part 3 please, if you're ready to hear what happened next at the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. Like, share, and subscribe to uncover more of LaToya's chilling story. Part 3. The weight of generations. Time moves differently for those who carry the weight of generations. That's what LaToya told Drive Aldrich during one of their daily sessions. I remember being young, she said softly. But I also remember being old. I remember dying, and I remember being born. The line between past and present, it dissolved long ago. Dr. Aldrich, though disturbed, wrote everything down. He tried to explain her words through the lens of science. Perhaps she suffered from some form of dissociative identity disorder, creating fantasies to cope with childhood trauma. It would explain the fragmented memories, the foreign language, the visions. But the facts kept getting in the way. LaToya knew things she shouldn't. Details of history, names of people long dead, events that had never been written down. She could predict when a nurse would trip over a bucket or when the bells in town would ring, often seconds before they did. The hospital staff began to divide. Some saw LaToya as a miracle, or at least a mystery worth studying. Others whispered that she was cursed, that her presence brought something dark into the halls of Blessed Mercy. Sister Mary Catherine, the nun from Sacred Heart Convent, found herself caught between her faith and her curiosity. Greater than, I have seen what the church calls miracles, she told Drive Aldrich one morning. I've seen prayer heal the dying. But this feels older than any prayer. It doesn't feel evil, but it doesn't feel good either. It just feels old. Then Mrs. Hitchcock made a shocking request. She asked to be moved to the bed next to LaToya's. The dreams I have near her, she explained, they're not just dreams. I see my husband, Samuel. I see him laugh, hum the little songs he used to sing in the garden. I hear the exact words he spoke on our wedding day. She's helping me remember the things I thought were gone forever. Dr. Aldrich reluctantly approved the change. But soon, other patients began requesting the same. Those who were placed near LaToya reported vivid dreams, peaceful sleep, and even physical improvements. But not everyone reacted that way. Jacob Morrison, a merchant recovering from dysentery, suffered violent nightmares in her presence, visions of slavery, pain, and guilt he couldn't explain. I see things I know I never did, he said through clenched teeth. But they feel like memories. I see myself hurting people. Chained people. I feel guilt I don't deserve. Dr. Aldrich moved him to another wing. His condition improved almost immediately. But the hospital itself was changing. Staff who used to avoid LaToya's room now lingered there. Older employees grew nervous around her, especially those with strong religious beliefs. The younger nurses seemed less affected, more curious than afraid. On January 27, Reverend Whitmore returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought two other ministers, Reverend Isaiah Blackwood of the First Baptist Church and Reverend Cornelius Marsh from the Methodist congregation. The three men requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldrich. Greater than, we believe, Reverend Whitmore said quietly, that your patient may be practicing forms of worship that are not only un-Christian, but spiritually dangerous. They had heard reports from families of patients who were having visions and dreams with no connection to Christianity. Some spoke of ancient rituals. Others described spirits that weren't angels or demons, but something else. Dr. Aldrich didn't know what to say. He had taken an oath to help the sick, not judge their beliefs. But he couldn't deny what he'd seen. LaToya wasn't doing anything to harm people, yet she changed those around her in ways he couldn't explain. They agreed on a compromise. The ministers would be allowed to observe LaToya's interactions. In exchange, Drive Aldrich could continue his medical study without interference. The joint observations began on February 1, 1847. They set up a routine, carefully monitored sessions, strict note-taking, and separate journals. The first major shift came from Reverend Blackwood. A deeply spiritual man, he began noticing strange coincidences. LaToya would start speaking her unknown language exactly when a patient was in distress. Somehow, her words seemed to ease their pain, even if they didn't understand a single syllable. Greater than, it's not the words, Reverend Blackwood wrote in his private notes. It's the way she says them. It's like her spirit connects to theirs. She feels what they feel. Dr. Aldrich, now fully invested, started conducting more controlled tests. He would hide behind a curtain, watching LaToya interact with patients. Every time, something strange happened. One day, she was introduced to Mr. Jeremiah Couch, a 70-year-old farmer with a stubborn cough. No medicine had helped, but within minutes of meeting LaToya, Mr. Couch began talking about his time in the War of 1812, things he had never shared before. Stories of battles, friends lost, fears buried. By the end of the session, his breathing had cleared. Greater than, she didn't just take the sickness, he said later. She took the memories too, the ones that hurt, and gave them back to me in a way I could carry. But the most shocking event came during a session with young Timothy Wadsworth, a 12-year-old boy whose parents believed he was possessed. He spoke in strange voices, saw things that weren't there, and described events from Millbrook's history that no one had taught him. When he met LaToya, everything changed. They sat silently at first. Then Timothy began to speak, in the same unknown language as LaToya. They spoke back and forth for nearly an hour. Calm, peaceful, connected. Dr. Aldrich, hidden behind the curtain, recorded every word. Greater than, they weren't just talking, he wrote. They were remembering, together. Timothy spoke of events that happened before he was born. He named families buried in unmarked graves. He described old land disputes and town secrets that were never recorded. And he didn't just know these facts, he felt them, like they belonged to him. After the session, Timothy had no memory of the conversation. But his fit stopped completely. Within a week, his parents took him home, fully recovered. The ministers saw it as proof of divine healing. Dr. Aldrich wasn't so sure, and just when he thought he'd seen everything, Brennan made another discovery in the archives of the Salem Historical Society. Among a bundle of forgotten letters, he found the writings of Reverend Josiah Mather, a long-dead preacher who lived near Millbrook in the 1820s. In one letter, dated 1826, the Reverend described a young woman living alone in the woods, speaking a strange language, healing the sick, and appearing exactly as LaToya looked now. She hadn't aged a day. To be continued in Part 4. Right finger if you want Part 4, comment, keep going, and make sure you're subscribed. This mystery is only beginning, and the truth might be older than America itself. Part 4. The Bones Beneath. Dr. Brennan was the first to uncover the old letters. While organizing archived documents in the hospital basement, he came across a bundle marked, Rev. Josiah Mather, 1827-1829. Curiosity overcame him, and he began to read. The letters spoke of a strange young woman Reverend Mather had been sent to convert and civilize. He described her as a vessel of heathen knowledge, someone who spoke in tongues older than Babel, and carried memories not learned through stories, but lived through time. Greater than, she remembers the suffering of her people, Mather wrote. Not as something taught, but as something witnessed. She speaks of pain and healing in ways no Christian teaching has ever prepared me for. He called her, the child of many mothers. He spent 3 years with her, trying to save her soul. But his final letter, dated December 1829, revealed a disturbing truth. Greater than, I can no longer continue this work, he confessed. She has shown me things, truths about human suffering, that I cannot accept. I fear I've seen something no mortal should ever witness. I pray God forgives me for walking away, but I cannot be the bridge between her world and ours. Brennan shared the letters with the hospital board. When they cross-checked the timeline, they found it matched the exact years following LaToya's disappearance from the Presbyterian family. This meant she could be the same girl, a story continuing across decades without explanation. Rumors quickly spread among the staff. Nurse Margaret Thornton began dreaming of Millbrook's past. Not vague impressions, but vivid scenes, town meetings, land negotiations, births and deaths, from the 1700s and early 1800s. Details she had never read or learned before. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's most senior physician, reported hearing voices, clear, familiar voices of long-dead patients. He claimed they came to him through LaToya's presence. Some staff became uneasy and avoided her wing. Others felt mysteriously drawn to her, saying they worked better there. They felt more in tune with their patients. As if they could finally hear what went unsaid. The hospital's atmosphere grew tense. Dr. Aldrich, usually grounded in science, struggled to stay objective. He confessed in his private journal. Greater than, I feel I'm losing my scientific distance. Being around her, I remember my own childhood in flashes, things I'd forgotten. And when I treat patients, it's not just clinical anymore. I feel their pain, their fear, as if it's mine. I understand them, not just with knowledge, but with something deeper. Something I can't explain. This quiet unease exploded one night when Mrs. Hitchcock, the elderly pneumonia patient who had asked to be placed near LaToya, made a final request. Weak and pale, she whispered to Dr. Aldrich. Greater than, she's shown me things, doctor. Not just about my Samuel, but about this town. This hospital. Things buried deep. Things people have died to keep secret. Alarmed, Aldrich cleared his evening schedule. Reverend Whitmore insisted on joining, believing spiritual guidance was now essential. That night, in her private room, Mrs. Hitchcock shared everything. Greater than, she doesn't just remember the past, she said slowly. She carries it with her, like a burden. LaToya had told her about the land the hospital stood on. Long before the first bricks of Blessed Mercy Infirmary were laid, this ground had been sacred to the Pennaquick tribe, the region's original inhabitants. Elders had performed sacred rites here, not only for their ancestors, but for all who had suffered and died on this soil. Greater than, she said this was a place of memory. A place of mourning, Mrs. Hitchcock continued. They honored even those brought here in chains, enslaved people who died far from home, buried without names, without prayers. She says their bones are still here, beneath our feet. Dr. Aldrich felt the temperature in the room drop, though no window was open. Greater than, she told me, Mrs. Hitchcock went on, her voice shaking now, that their spirits cry out, not for revenge, but for recognition. For someone to remember their names. Their pain, their stories. She reached for Aldrich's hand. Greater than, and I think LaToya hears them. I think, maybe she always has. For a long moment, no one spoke. Reverend Whitmore stood silently, eyes closed, lips moving in a prayer too soft to hear. When the meeting ended, Aldrich couldn't sleep. He walked the dark halls of the hospital, listening. Not for machines or footsteps, but for whispers in the silence. For truths buried in the floorboards. In his heart, he knew something had shifted. This wasn't just about a strange girl with odd memories. This was about the soul of the town. The hospital, maybe even of history itself. The next day, Aldrich called an emergency meeting of the hospital board. Something had to be done. Because LaToya wasn't just remembering the past. She was living it. And now, it was waking up all around them. Part 5. The Forgotten Truth Beneath Blessed Mercy. The hospital's original construction records from 1834 mentioned something odd, irregular human remains discovered during the foundation digging. But Reverend Whitmore, who oversaw the project at the time, had quietly ordered them removed. When Mrs. Hitchcock reminded him of this during a hushed conversation, the color drained from his face. Dr. Aldrich, standing nearby, felt the pieces begin to click into place. There's more, Mrs. Hitchcock whispered. LaToya told me about a doctor who worked here in the early days, Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood, Reverend Blackwood's own father. She went on to describe how Blackwood had experimented on vulnerable patients, runaway slaves, native people, immigrants with no family. People who couldn't fight back. He had called it research into the primitive mind, keeping journals of every horrific detail. Dr. Aldrich knew he had to find those records, even if it meant uncovering something that could destroy his hospital's reputation. In the days that followed, he explored the hospital's basement archives. Deep in the dust and shadows, hidden behind old administrative records, he found them, a collection of leather-bound journals signed Drive N. Blackwood. Their contents chilled him. The journals revealed procedures that would be considered barbaric even by 19th-century standards, physical endurance tests, psychological torture, and racial pain response experiments. But most disturbing were the entries about patients with spiritual insight, people who spoke unknown languages, saw visions, or remembered events they couldn't have lived through. Greater than, several specimens show signs of heathen enlightenment. One entry read. They respond to unseen stimuli. I hope to isolate the source of their abilities and eliminate them through proper medical intervention. It got worse. Dr. Blackwood had focused particularly on one patient, a young black woman brought in from the woods in 1838. She had memories that stretched beyond her lifetime. She resisted every treatment. Blackwood's final recommendation. Greater than, she must be permanently confined. Her development is incompatible with Christian civilization. Dr. Aldrich's stomach dropped. The timeline fit. The girl from the woods was LaToya. She had been captured, institutionalized, and subjected to procedures meant to erase her identity. But according to the final journal entries, Blackwood had failed. In fact, his last writings were full of fear and confusion. Greater than, the past and present are blurring, he wrote. I remember things from their lives as if they were mine. I dream of chains, of stolen children, of rituals in unknown tongues. I tried to destroy her gift, but I believe it has infected me. A month later, he was dead. The official report claimed heart failure. But when Reverend Blackwood finally confessed the truth, it was something much darker. Greater than, my father took his own life, he admitted. To Dr. Aldrich. Before he died, he said she showed him our family's sins, and he couldn't live with it. The confession shook the very foundation of the hospital. It meant LaToya's power didn't just uncover her own past. She unearthed everyone's, including the guilt buried in the hearts of the oppressors. And now, that past was bleeding into the present. Patients started having vivid dreams, visions of slavery, war, and forgotten rituals. Staff began experiencing memories that weren't theirs. Hallways grew colder. Doors opened by themselves. In LaToya's wing, the temperature swung wildly, and voices whispered in ancient tongues. Something was awakening. Dr. Aldrich and Reverend Whitmore gathered the senior staff and the remaining ministers. They had no more excuses, no more theories to hide behind. This girl carries more than trauma, Aldrich told them. She carries memory, truth, and we must hear her out. On February 20, 1847, he called a special gathering in the hospital's chapel. Ministers, doctors, and even a few lucid patients gathered, holding their breath. LaToya entered in a plain white dress, eyes calm but powerful. She stood in the center of the room. As she began to speak, the temperature shifted, some felt heat, others a deep cold. The air felt charged, as if unseen beings had filled the space. Greater than, I am not one person, she said clearly. I carry voices, of the forgotten, the stolen, the erased. You call it madness, I call it memory. Gasps echoed around the room. Some attendees began to cry without knowing why. Greater than, this place was sacred long before your hospital, she continued. My people, your people, buried their dead here. They sang, they healed, then they were silenced. But I remember. And now, so will you. A deep silence followed, not just the absence of sound, but the kind that comes when truth settles in the bones. And in that moment, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary was no longer just a hospital. It was a vessel for generations of unspoken pain, and LaToya had become its voice. End of part 5. Let me know when you're ready for part 6. Part 6. The Voices Beneath the Earth. LaToya, you must understand, Reverend Blackwood pleaded, his voice hollow, trembling. We never knew the truth. My father, he never. But LaToya was no longer listening to excuses. Her voice cut through the silence of the chapel like a blade. Enslaved people were hidden in this earth when their masters denied them a proper burial. Gasps swept through the room. Dr. Aldrich, a man of science and charts, felt something inside him cracking. Not fear, something deeper, doubt, his skepticism, his logic, all of it wavered as he looked around. Patients sat up straighter, breathing eased, pain seemed to lift. Staff members who had quietly suffered from strange dreams, visions of faces they didn't know, memories that didn't belong to them, began nodding in stunned recognition. When Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood brought me here in 1838, LaToya said, her eyes fixed on the Reverend, he believed he could sever the bond between my spirit and the ancestors who speak through me. Reverend Blackwood sank back into his seat, his face pale as bone. He used instruments, she continued, tools to destroy what he didn't understand, my gift, my connection. But he failed. Every moment of pain he inflicted only deepened my ability to hold their stories. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I carry not just my memories, but theirs, those lost, those silenced, those buried beneath this very ground. The room sat in stunned silence. A nurse broke into quiet sobs. A janitor looked down at his shoes, ashamed. For months, LaToya had been their patient, a curiosity, an inconvenience. Now they saw her for what she truly was, a vessel for truth, a voice for the forgotten. She turned to the Reverend again. Your father came to understand what he had done, too late. In our final session, he looked into my eyes and saw the truth. Not just his victim's pain, but the spiritual torment of being part of such evil. That guilt, it destroyed him. Reverend Blackwood stood, trembling. What can we do? He asked, tears spilling freely. How can we make it right? LaToya gave him a soft, sad smile, the first since she had entered the hospital. Acknowledgement is the first step, she said gently. But true redemption requires action. She walked to the front of the chapel, toward the altar where Reverend Whitmore often led quiet services. And then, something extraordinary began to happen. Patients began to speak, but the voices that came out were not their own. Mrs. Hitchcock, the elderly woman bedridden with pneumonia, suddenly sat upright. Her voice was strong, deep, and clear. She began reciting names, dozens of names, names of the forgotten, the enslaved, the buried. Then little Timothy Wadsworth stood, eyes glowing with something ancient and powerful. He described in vivid detail the original burial grounds, land now paved over by hospital construction. He spoke of ceremonial artifacts stolen, bones displaced, rituals violated. Others joined. A teenage girl, a mute man, a once violent patient who hadn't spoken in years, all spoke with voices not their own. Stories flowed. Families torn apart, children who died in chains, traditions crushed under boots and ignorance. It was not madness. It was testimony. Dr. Aldrich watched, stunned. These weren't hallucinations. This wasn't psychosis. This was history, speaking through the broken. LaToya turned to the staff. The healing you practice in this building, she said, is incomplete. Until you acknowledge the pain beneath your foundations, you cannot truly help anyone. She looked around the chapel, her gaze hard but not unkind. Every person who walks through your doors carries not only their own wounds, but the scars of generations. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's oldest physician, stood slowly. I've practiced medicine for 40 years, he said, voice cracking with emotion. I've seen people survive the impossible. And others, healthy, young, hopeful, die for no reason. I always thought it was luck or fate. He looked at LaToya. But you're saying, their pain was never just theirs. It belonged to the ones who came before. LaToya nodded. Exactly. The ancestors live within us. Their unfinished stories, if left unspoken, become our burdens. Sister Mary Catherine stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her eyes held something fierce. In our faith, she said, we speak of the communion of saints, the belief that the dead and the living are connected through divine love. What you're describing, it's that, but deeper. Rawr. LaToya smiled. You're beginning to see. She paused, then added, but with that connection comes responsibility. Those like me, carriers of ancestral memory, serve as bridges between worlds. We help the living understand the cost of forgetting. We help the dead find peace. The chapel was silent again, but the air had changed. There was a lightness, a stillness, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. Dr. Aldrich noticed the sun streaming through the stained glass windows. The colors were brighter. The hum of machines and chatter from the wards had faded to a peaceful silence. A peace the hospital hadn't known in decades. LaToya stood in the center of it all, calm, whole, and unafraid. Dr. Aldrich stepped forward. What will happen to you now? LaToya looked at him kindly. My work here is almost complete. The stories have been told. The suffering has been acknowledged. The promise of change has been made. She reached into her dress and pulled out the old brass locket she had carried since the day she arrived. She opened it. Inside was no picture, no keepsake, only a small clump of soil. This, she said softly, is earth from my ancestors' burial ground. I carried it so they would never be forgotten. Now, they can finally rest. She looked out at the people gathered before her. Doctors, nurses, nuns, patients. The burden now passes to you. If this story gave you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Tap that like button, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in the town of Millbrook, because the silence never lasts for long. Part 7. The Disappearance of LaToya. Dr. Aldrich didn't sleep much the night after the chapel gathering. His mind spun with everything he'd seen, patients speaking in voices not their own, ancestral memories flooding the room, and LaToya standing calmly in the center of it all, as if she were a guide between this world and something far older. The next morning, the hospital was different. Quieter, lighter. Nurses noticed it first. The usual tension that clung to the halls like mold had lifted. Patients who had been restless or angry were now calm. Several who had been resistant to treatment suddenly became cooperative, even cheerful. Mrs. Hitchcock, who had been battling pneumonia for weeks, was walking around with more energy than she'd had in years. She described what happened in the chapel as a cleansing of the soul. She felt not only better physically, but somehow spiritually healed, as though something invisible had been removed from her chest. Timothy Wadsworth's parents wept when Dr. Aldrich told them their son's violent episodes had stopped. The boy was different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. He seemed to sense pain in others and had begun comforting patients, especially those who were grieving. It was all too much to explain in medical terms. And yet, the results were impossible to ignore. But as the days passed, Aldrich realized something chilling. What had taken place in that chapel would not be welcomed by the world outside. Rumors spread quickly. Some patients spoke openly about their experiences, and word got out. Soon, whispers reached the town. Ghosts, spiritualism, even witchcraft. Then came the backlash. On the 7th day after the chapel gathering, Mayor Blackwell arrived at the hospital with 2 men from the Massachusetts Medical Society. They demanded answers. Unknown languages. The mayor barked. Voices of the dead. This hospital is not some carnival sideshow. Dr. Aldrich tried to reason with them, explaining only the clinical improvements. But they didn't care about results. They cared about appearances. The community must not be associated with heresy, one of the medical men said. You're on thin ice, doctor. Then they mentioned LaToya. They wanted her gone. She's a disturbance, said the mayor. She's encouraging madness. The very woman who had helped so many was now seen as a threat. Aldrich was furious but helpless. He couldn't risk the hospital being shut down. Not now, not after what had just begun to bloom. And then, as if she knew, LaToya made her decision. On the morning of February 28, she asked to speak with Aldrich privately. He found her folding her few clothes into a small canvas bag. "I'm leaving," she said softly. He felt his stomach drop. "You can't. Not now. The hospital, these people, they need you." "They've already been helped," she said. "The healing that needed to happen has happened. The rest is up to you." He tried to convince her to stay. She refused any compensation, no spotlight, no glory, just peace. "You know as well as I do," she said, "that if I stay, they'll turn everything we did into something ugly. They'll bury the truth to protect their power." Before she left, she handed Aldrich a sealed letter addressed to the hospital board. Inside, she formally released them from any responsibility and asked that her medical records be sealed, to protect everyone involved. She also included one final request, that the burial ground beneath the hospital be recognized, honored, and never forgotten. And then she was gone. On the morning of March 1, her bed was empty. The night nurse had seen her sleeping peacefully at midnight, but by dawn, she had vanished. No footprints, no witnesses, just the brass locket still resting on the chapel altar. Aldrich was never the same after that. He followed LaToya's instructions to the letter. He introduced new treatment methods that focused on healing not just the body, but the mind and soul. He emphasized family history, community pain, and cultural trauma. He started group sessions that allowed patients to speak their truth, no matter how strange. Most importantly, he worked with Reverend Whitmore to build a garden. A memorial. On the land where the dead had once been forgotten, they planted wildflowers and placed stones with names spoken during the chapel gathering. In the center stood a stone monument with a simple message. "To those who suffered in silence, you are heard. You are remembered." The effect on the hospital was dramatic. Recovery times shortened, staff morale improved, and though no one said it out loud, many believed the hospital itself had been cleansed. Still, Aldrich kept the truth hidden in his private journals. The official records told a sanitized story. LaToya was listed as a patient with dissociative symptoms who responded to group therapy. No mention of spirits, no mention of ancestral voices. Just a success story that the world could understand. And yet, he never stopped wondering, who was LaToya, really? A prophet, a healer, something more. 30 years later, in 1877, Aldrich received a letter from a fellow doctor in Ohio. It described a young woman who matched LaToya's exact appearance and behavior, mixed heritage, mid-20s, speaking in strange languages, healing the unhealable. It wasn't the only report. Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, always the same description, always the same effects. Was it LaToya again, or others like her? Was she part of something larger? A network of hidden healers who carried history in their bones and whispered truths the world tried to forget. Dr. Aldrich didn't have answers, but in his final journal, written before his death in 1889, he wrote, "Greater than, we are not alone. Our pain is not just our own. And healing must begin where the wound first opened. LaToya showed us the map, we must choose to follow it." Want to uncover what happened next? In Part 8, we'll reveal how Aldrich's hidden journals almost exposed the entire truth, and the strange fate of the brass locket that refused to stay buried. Part 8. The Journal and the Locket. In the months after LaToya's disappearance, Aldrich poured his energy into transformation. The chapel became a sanctuary for reflection. The memorial garden began attracting visitors from the community. Some came out of curiosity, others in quiet mourning for relatives they never got to bury properly. But not everyone was at peace. Rumors still drifted through town like smoke, accusations of witchcraft, of madness. The Massachusetts Medical Society sent 2 more investigators, this time more aggressive in their questioning. They demanded access to Dr. Aldrich's private notes, suspecting that the hospital was covering up unorthodox treatments. Aldrich refused. What he had recorded wasn't just data, it was sacred. In a locked drawer of his study, he kept the real record, a thick leather-bound journal filled with patient testimonies, spiritual encounters, names spoken by voices not their own, and detailed descriptions of what happened the night of the chapel gathering. He wrote everything, and he kept writing, about the patients who, months later, still described dreams in which unfamiliar ancestors appeared to them. About the nurses who swore the old halls no longer creaked like they used to, as if the building itself had finally stopped groaning from the weight of buried grief. And about the brass locket, still sitting undisturbed on the chapel altar, untouched, yet never dusty. One nurse, Margaret, claimed the locket gave off a low hum when she stood near it, so soft you almost thought you imagined it. Another swore it moved once, slightly, on its own. Dr. Aldrich dismissed these claims publicly, but privately, he listened carefully. He had grown into a man who trusted what could not always be measured. Then something strange happened. In October of that year, a fire broke out in the east wing of the hospital. No one was hurt, but the medical records room, containing hundreds of patient files, was destroyed. Everything, except the drawer containing Aldrich's private journal. When firefighters cleared the ruins, they found the drawer fully intact amid the ash. Not a burn, not a scorch mark. It was impossible, but there it was. Aldrich took it as a sign. He began making copies of his journal in secret, sending them to trusted physicians across the country, men and women who had shown openness to new ways of healing. He knew the world wasn't ready for the full truth, but he hoped a few might carry the torch forward. One such doctor, Amelia Barrett of Richmond, wrote back after reading his account. Her words chilled him. Greater than, I have seen her, or someone like her. A woman, early 20s, mixed ancestry. She spoke a name only my great-grandmother had ever used. No one else could have known it. She healed 3 of my patients in 3 days. And the letters kept coming. From Illinois, from Georgia, from Missouri, always the same. A mysterious young woman, helping the sick by revealing unspoken truths, guiding people through their ancestral pain. Sometimes she left behind small tokens. A flower, a ribbon, a charm. But never a locket. No one had seen one like LaToya's. Back in Millbrook, Reverend Whitmore had also started writing, in sermons and personal reflections. He began giving quiet talks to small groups about spiritual inheritances, how pain could be passed down through blood, how grief could live in bones, not just minds. The church elders weren't thrilled. But he didn't care. What he saw that night had changed him. Still, the outside pressure continued. In early 1848, a wealthy land developer made an offer to purchase the hospital grounds. Rumor was he wanted to tear down the building and construct a luxury spa for the wealthy. When his proposal was rejected, he went to the mayor with accusations of misconduct at the infirmary. That's when things got serious. An anonymous letter reached the mayor's office, claiming Aldrich had allowed pagan rituals to take place on hospital grounds, that he had abandoned the teachings of medicine for mysticism. A formal investigation was opened. Panicked, the board of directors begged Aldrich to hand over anything unusual that could be used against them. He gave them only one thing, LaToya's formal letter, the one releasing the hospital of all responsibility and requesting her records be sealed. That was enough to quiet things down. At least for a while. But Aldrich knew it was only temporary. Something told him the full truth would one day come under fire. So he made one final decision. He took the original brass locket from the chapel altar and sealed it in a hollow space beneath the memorial stone in the garden. He said nothing to anyone. Not even Reverend Whitmore. He believed the locket had already served its purpose. It belonged to the land now. And yet, it didn't stay buried. In 1923, 76 years after the chapel gathering, the old hospital was finally torn down to make way for a modern facility. During the demolition, workers documented every artifact they found. The chapel was carefully disassembled, stone by stone. But when they opened the Memorial Garden's central monument to check for historical contents, the locket was gone. No record of it being removed. No sign of forced entry. Gone. Today, the place where Blessed Mercy Infirmary once stood is a quiet city park. Children play there. Dogs run across the grass. Most passers-by have no idea what stood there. No idea what happened beneath their feet in 1847. But some visitors do. They don't know the full story. They just feel something. A sense of peace. A strange warmth in their chest. A weight lifted they hadn't even known they carried. One elderly man told a park ranger, "I came here to clear my head after my wife died. I don't know why, but sitting on that bench under the tree, I felt her. Not just a memory, like she was actually with me." He smiled, wiping a tear. "I walked out of here, lighter." The ranger didn't know what to say. She just nodded, because she had felt it too. Part 9 coming next. A new witness emerges with a photograph from 1875, and in the background, someone who looks exactly like LaToya. Is she still alive, or is something more mysterious at work? Part 9. The woman in the photograph. In the spring of 1922, just 1 year before the demolition of Blessed Mercy Infirmary, a package arrived at the home of Dr. Aldrich's only surviving relative, his great-niece, Eleanor Aldrich. Eleanor had inherited the old doctor's journals, carefully stored in a weathered trunk in her attic. She hadn't paid them much attention, chalking them up to the eccentric writings of an aging man. That changed the moment she opened the package. Inside was a letter, written in an elegant, steady hand. "Greater than, I believe you may want to see this. I do not know who the woman is, but something tells me she matters to your family." This photograph was taken at a healing retreat in Virginia, in 1875. Below the letter was a faded black and white photo. It showed a small group of people gathered in a garden, standing in a loose circle around a sick child who was lying on a cot. One figure stood out immediately. A woman, mid-20s, wearing a simple dress and a shawl over her head. Her face, though slightly blurred, was unmistakable. Eleanor didn't know how she knew, she just knew. It was LaToya, the woman her great-uncle had written about in such detail, whose presence had upended an entire hospital. But how? If the photograph was real, and all signs pointed to it being authentic, it would mean LaToya had not only vanished, she had somehow remained exactly the same for decades. Eleanor dug through Aldrich's old journals for answers. Her hands shook as she flipped through pages until she found the entry dated March 5, 1877, 5 years after the photo had been taken. It described a letter from a doctor in Ohio. Greater than, she has not aged. Not a wrinkle, not a line, the same eyes, the same presence. She remembered things no one could have known. She spoke in languages I could not identify. She healed patients I had given up on. Eleanor stared at the passage for a long time. Then she stared at the photograph again. The woman in it didn't look like a ghost or a spirit. She looked alive, solid, kind-eyed, real, but clearly, something was not normal. Eleanor decided to visit Millbrook and see the site of the old infirmary for herself. The hospital was long gone. All that remained was the small park and a plaque describing the site's history in vague, respectful language. Here once stood Blessed Mercy Infirmary. May those who suffered here rest in peace. She sat on a bench beneath a crooked tree in the center of the park and quietly unfolded the photograph in her lap. An elderly woman walking her dog paused nearby. "That's an old one," she said, peering at the photo. "Where did you get it?" Eleanor hesitated. "It was mailed to me." "That woman," she pointed. "Do you recognize her?" The woman squinted. "Can't say I've seen her, but, you're not the first person to come here with a story." "What do you mean?" "I used to work in the records office when they tore down the hospital. People said things about this place, about the chapel, about a woman who healed people without medicine. Most of it got buried. They didn't want the public talking about it." Eleanor nodded. "I think my great-uncle was part of it. Dr. Aldrich." The woman's eyes lit up. "That explains it. He was the one who built the garden, right? Some of the old records say he buried something sacred under the memorial stone." Eleanor smiled. "He did. A brass locket. Funny thing," the woman said. "That locket vanished during demolition. Never turned up." Eleanor shivered. She hadn't come expecting answers, but now more questions swirled. Who had mailed her the photograph? How had LaToya stayed unchanged for nearly 30 years? Was she human at all? Back at her hotel, Eleanor read through more of Aldrich's private notes. In one entry, he wondered if LaToya was part of a chain of memory, a being, or beings, who served as living vessels for ancestral pain. Greater than, whether she is one soul across time or many, I cannot say. But the gift is real. I have seen it change the sick, mend the grieving, soften even the most bitter hearts. That night, Eleanor dreamed of the park. She saw LaToya standing beneath the same crooked tree, her hands open, palms facing the earth. All around her, the air shimmered like heat on pavement. Voices rose, not yelling, not screaming, just speaking. Soft and layered, as if generations were whispering through her all at once. When Eleanor woke, she remembered one phrase clearly, spoken in a voice that sounded like LaToya's. Greater than, the burden of memory must be shared, or it becomes a curse. In the following days, Eleanor reached out to historians, spiritual researchers, and medical professionals. She showed them the photograph. She shared her great-uncle's writings. Most politely dismissed her, but a few listened closely. One woman, a cultural anthropologist named Camille Waters, invited Eleanor to speak at a small conference on inherited trauma and spiritual healing. There, Eleanor shared LaToya's story with a group of open-minded scholars. Afterward, one attendee, a quiet young man, approached her with a worn notebook in his hand. "My grandmother," he said. "She lived in rural Louisiana. She used to tell stories about a wandering woman who came to town, helped people through their grief, and then disappeared. Said she could hear your dead speak through you." He flipped open the notebook and showed Eleanor a hand-drawn sketch. The resemblance was unmistakable. LaToya, again, different dress, different town, same age, same eyes. Eleanor took a breath. She was no longer sure if LaToya had ever been just one person. Maybe she was many. Maybe she was all. A spirit reborn again and again, wherever the pain of the past cried out for healing. A messenger, a mirror, a memory, living only through those willing to carry the weight and speak the truth. And if that were the case, then maybe the locket hadn't vanished. Maybe it had returned to her. Or maybe, it had found its next bearer. Part 10 Final LaToya's legacy lives on. In a forgotten hospital basement, a young nurse finds a strange, glowing object, and begins to hear voices that don't belong to her. Could the cycle be starting again? Part 10. The New Voice. In 2022, more than 170 years after the events at Blessed Mercy Infirmary, the land where the old hospital once stood had become a public park. Families picnicked on the grass. Teenagers took selfies by the crooked tree. Few knew the land's history. Fewer still cared, but the land hadn't forgotten. And neither had the dead. On a warm September afternoon, a young nursing student named Maya Green arrived in Millbrook. She had just started her clinical rotation at St. Mercy Community Hospital, the modern medical center built not far from the original infirmary's site. Maya had always been sensitive. Ever since she was a child, she could feel the emotions of people around her, grief, anger, sorrow, sometimes even before they spoke. Her grandmother once told her, "You carry something old in your bones, child. A gift or a burden. You'll figure out which." During her first week at the hospital, Maya noticed something odd. In the staff lounge, a faded photograph hung near the coffee machine, a black and white group portrait from 1901 showing early hospital staff. In the corner of the photo stood a woman who didn't seem to belong. She wasn't dressed like the others. Her face was partially turned, but Maya could see enough. There was something familiar about her. The second week, Maya was assigned to help reorganize old storage in the hospital's basement, a dusty, neglected space used mostly for forgotten equipment and moldy records. She went alone. It was quiet, too quiet. While sorting through rusted boxes, Maya noticed a narrow crawlspace behind a broken shelf. Curious, she squeezed through. There, half buried in dirt and cobwebs, was a small wooden box. Old, unmarked. Inside it was a single object. A brass locket, cold to the touch, yet it hummed faintly in her hand. Not in sound, but in feeling. Like the low vibration of a memory trying to rise. She opened it. No picture inside, only a scrap of parchment, yellowed with age. On it was a single phrase. Greater than, speak what they could not. Suddenly, the air around her thickened. Her heart raced. She wasn't alone anymore. Voices. Soft at first. Whispering. Dozens. No, hundreds. Not frightening, but heavy. Weighted with sorrow, longing, truth. Names. Stories. Maya dropped the locket in shock, backing against the wall, breathing hard. But the voices didn't stop. They were inside her now. Not screaming, but pleading. Remember us. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. In her dreams, she stood in a room that looked like a chapel lit by candlelight. She saw rows of patients in old hospital gowns, all looking toward a single woman standing at the front, LaToya. She turned and looked straight at Maya. "You're the next one," she said gently. "The work isn't done." Maya woke with tears on her cheeks. Over the following weeks, strange things began to happen. Patients opened up to her in ways they didn't with anyone else. They shared secrets, old memories, griefs they had buried for decades. One man said, "I don't know why I'm telling you this. I haven't spoken about it since Vietnam." Another whispered, "My mother lost a baby before I was born. I've always felt like a ghost was following me, and now, I feel like it's gone." Maya didn't know what she was doing. She only listened. And still, the voices came. Sometimes when she passed the garden in the park, sometimes in the hospital halls, sometimes just before sleep. She began writing their names in a notebook. Not sure why, just so they wouldn't be forgotten. Then, one day, a woman visited the hospital. An older woman, in her 70s, dressed simply, with kind eyes and a quiet presence. She asked for Maya. "I don't know how I know this," she said, "but I think you found something. Something you're not sure how to carry." Maya stared at her. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "Just someone who once saw a photo. And knew that the woman in it was not ordinary." She placed a folded paper in Maya's hand. It was a photocopy of the 1875 Virginia photograph. The one with LaToya. Maya's hands shook. The woman leaned in close. "You're not crazy. You're not alone. What you feel, it's real. But you don't have to carry it all yourself." Then she left. No name, no goodbye, just silence. Maya went to the park that evening. She brought the locket and placed it gently beneath the crooked tree, covering it with soft soil. She whispered, "Greater than, I hear you. I will remember." And in that moment, the wind picked up, not harsh, but warm. Comforting, as if something old and tired had finally exhaled. In the years that followed, Maya became known as more than a nurse. Patients called her a healer, though she never advertised anything beyond listening. She created small support groups focused on ancestral grief, inherited trauma, and silent sorrow. She wrote articles, gave quiet talks, and eventually published a book based on the stories she'd heard. But the locket, she never saw it again. Some say it vanished, returned to the earth once more. Others say it moved on, waiting for the next bearer, in the next time, in the next place. But Maya believed something different. She believed the locket had done its job. Because she no longer needed it. She had become what LaToya once was. A bridge. Epilogue. The unanswered question. We may never know who LaToya truly was. A healer, a spirit, a vessel for the forgotten. But her legacy remains. In every act of compassion that reaches deeper than words. In every attempt to listen to the pain behind the silence. And in every person, like Maya, who dares to carry the weight of memory so others can finally let it go. Because the past does not stay buried. It whispers. And sometimes, if the right heart is listening, it finally gets to speak. The end.